There are people who stand in front of thousands, voice steady, eyes bright, words falling like rain on dry ground. And nobody in that crowd has any idea what it cost to get there. Nobody sees the version of the story that happened before the lights came on. Nobody sees the girl who sat alone in a hospital room at 14, staring at a ceiling she didn't know how to explain to anyone. Nobody sees the young woman who looked at her own reflection and genuinely didn't recognize the person staring back. What happens when the daughter of one of the most famous pastors in America becomes everything the church was afraid of? Teenage pregnancy, public shame, a failed marriage, before she was old enough to vote. What happens when someone who was supposed to carry a legacy nearly destroys it before she even understands what it means? And what does it look like when that same woman walks back into the very arena that watched her fall, not crawling, not apologizing, but standing at full height, voice unshaking, wearing every scar like a crown? This is not a redemption story. It is something rarer than that. This is the story of a woman who refused to let anyone else write her ending. And by the time you finish watching this, you will never look at her the same way again. She was born into a world most people only see on Sunday mornings. Her father was Bishop T.D. Jakes, not just a preacher, but a phenomenon, a man whose voice could fill stadiums, whose name was already becoming synonymous with transformation and divine encounter. Growing up in the Jakes household meant growing up inside something enormous, something that had its own gravity, its own rules, its own silent expectations. Sarah was not simply the pastor's daughter. She was the pastor's daughter in a tradition where that title carries the full weight of a congregation's hopes, where little girls are dressed in white and watched carefully, where the standard is not whispered, it is woven into the walls of the church itself. She grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, in the early years, before Dallas, before the megachurch, before the Potter's House became a name known around the world. In those early years, her father was building something from almost nothing, preaching to small crowds, believing in a vision that most people around him couldn't yet see. Her mother, Sarita, stood beside him, quiet, graceful, anchoring everything with a steadiness that became its own kind of sermon. Sarah watched all of this. She absorbed it. The faith, the sacrifice, the beauty of what her parents were building together. She took it all in with the eyes of a child who understands more than the adults around her realize. But there was something else Sarah absorbed in those early years. She absorbed the distance. Her father was always somewhere, preaching, traveling, building, pouring himself into other people's wounds. He was present in the way that great men are often present, visibly, publicly, powerfully, and yet somehow not entirely there in the quiet, ordinary moments a daughter needs. This is not a criticism. It is simply the truth of what it means to be raised beside a calling as large as his. Sarah loved her father with a ferocity that never wavered. But love and longing are not the same thing. And growing up, she felt both simultaneously, sometimes unable to separate one from the other. She was a bright child, perceptive in the way that children who spend a lot of time watching adults become perceptive. She could read a room before she could read a book fluently. She could sense emotional undercurrents the way some people sense weather changing. And she was funny, sharp, quick, able to make the people around her laugh in a way that felt like relief. But underneath all of that brightness was something she didn't have language for yet. A kind of hunger, a need that she could feel in her chest but couldn't name. She was searching for something, even then. She just didn't know yet what she was searching for, or how far down the wrong road that search would eventually take her. When the family moved to Dallas and the Potter's House began to rise, first hundreds, then thousands, eventually tens of thousands, everything changed. Sarah was a teenager now, and suddenly she was not just the pastor's daughter in a small city. She was the pastor's daughter in one of the fastest-growing megachurches in the entire country. The eyes on her multiplied, the expectation around her thickened, and the distance she felt, that quiet ache, that unnamed hunger, It didn't disappear in the spotlight. If anything, the brightness made the shadows inside her feel darker by contrast. She was 14 years old when she discovered she was pregnant. Let that land for a moment. 14. The daughter of Bishop T.D. Jakes. Inside the walls of one of the most watched Christian communities in America. 14 years old, sitting with information that felt like a grenade she didn't know how to hold. In a house where purity was not just a personal value, but a public one. The fear that moved through her in those first days was not just fear of her parents' reaction, or fear of what the church would say, or fear of her own future suddenly narrowing into something unrecognizable. It was all of those things layered on top of each other, pressing down on a girl whose body was still becoming, whose sense of self was still forming, who had not yet had the chance to make a single consequential choice for herself before this one was made for her. The pregnancy became public. In a family like hers, there was no quiet way to contain it. The church community knew. The whispers moved fast. And Sarah, who had grown up inside that community, who had been watched and admired and held up as an example, now became a different kind of example. The kind people use to warn their own daughters. The kind people shake their heads about in hushed, gentle, devastating tones. She lost the child. The miscarriage was its own particular kind of grief. Grief complicated by shame, by relief, by guilt about the relief, by the impossibility of processing any of it publicly when you are 14 and everyone is already watching. The journal she started keeping around this time became something she carried everywhere. A small, worn notebook. Nothing decorative. Just pages and a pen and a private space where the words she couldn't speak out loud could exist without judgment. That journal was the first place Sarah Jakes told the truth about herself. The first place she admitted fear, admitted confusion, admitted that she did not know who she was underneath the name and the expectation and the congregation's gaze. It was a small, private act of survival, and it mattered more than she knew. The years that followed were difficult in ways that compound. She made choices that reflected the hunger she still hadn't named. Choices that reached for closeness, for belonging, for the feeling of being chosen by someone for reasons that had nothing to do with her last name. At 19, she married for the first time. She was young in every sense of the word. Young in years, young in self-understanding, young in her ability to know what she needed versus what she wanted in the moment. The marriage didn't hold. It couldn't. She was not yet the person she needed to be to make something that permanent work, and neither, in truth, was he. The divorce was quiet in the way that divorces in Christian communities are never actually quiet. It was managed, navigated, absorbed into the church's machinery of grace and forgiveness. But the judgment was there, soft and persistent, like a low-frequency hum in every room she walked into. Divorced. Young. Mother now. She had a son, Malachi, from this marriage, and carrying all of it in a community where the template for womanhood was very specific, very narrow, and she had now officially stepped outside it in multiple directions. Here is where most stories would say she hit rock bottom. But Sarah Jakes hadn't arrived at the bottom yet. She was still falling. She began to use food as a way to manage the internal chaos she couldn't otherwise organize. This is a quiet thing, a private thing, something that happens in kitchens and alone in cars, and in the middle of the night when the weight of everything becomes a physical sensation that needs somewhere to go. She gained weight. She pulled back from public life. She stopped being the person everyone had expected her to become and became instead a person who was simply trying to survive the interior of her own mind, one day at a time. The church community noticed. Opinions were formed. She heard some of them. Others reached her filtered through the particular cruelty of secondhand information. What someone said someone else had said, what a certain look meant, what a certain absence communicated. She was in her mid-20s. She had a child, a failed marriage, a public identity she didn't know how to inhabit, a private self she didn't know how to heal, and a father whose shadow was so large, so beloved, so consecrated, that standing inside it sometimes felt like disappearing entirely, and standing outside it felt like walking into a cold she hadn't prepared for. There was a night. She has spoken about this in pieces, in interviews, in the careful language of someone who has learned to tell the truth without shattering herself in the process, where she sat with the full weight of everything she had become or failed to become and simply didn't know how to keep going. Not in a dramatic, cinematic sense. In the quiet, devastating, ordinary sense of someone who has run out of reasons to try and hasn't yet found new ones. The stillness of that night was its own kind of loud. And inside that stillness, something shifted. She picked up the journal. She wrote, not because she had answers, not because she felt hope, but because somewhere in her, so deep it barely registered as instinct, she knew that the act of writing the truth down was the only thing that had ever made her feel less alone inside herself. So she wrote, and then she wrote again the next day, and the day after that. She began to share pieces of her story, quietly at first, tentatively, in small spaces, in conversations with women who were carrying similar weights. She wasn't preaching. She wasn't ministering. She was simply telling the truth and discovering, with a kind of wonder that surprised her, that the truth landed in other people like recognition, like relief, like finally. This was the first crack of light. She met Teray Roberts in 2013. He was a pastor himself, smooth, articulate, grounded in a faith that didn't flinch from complexity. Their courtship was public in the way that any relationship involving a Jakes will inevitably become public, but what was private was the depth of it. The way he saw her not as the pastor's daughter, not as the cautionary tale, not as the comeback story in progress, but as Sarah. Just Sarah. Full and complicated and worth pursuing completely. They married in 2014. And something in her, something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, began, slowly, to exhale. The writing continued. The voice grew stronger. She launched a blog, then a ministry, then began speaking publicly in ways that were nothing like the polished, rehearsed testimonies she had grown up watching. She spoke messily. Honestly, she stood in front of rooms of women and said things that pastors' daughters were not supposed to say. That faith doesn't make you immune to destruction, that God and grief are not opposites, that you can love the church and feel abandoned by it simultaneously, that wholeness is not the absence of brokenness, but something you build carefully in the middle of it. Women heard her, not because she was T.D. Jake's daughter, but because she was telling the truth about things nobody else in her position was willing to admit out loud. The Potter's house eventually invited her to teach. She stood in her father's pulpit, and that moment, that specific, deeply symbolic moment, was not a hand-me-down. She had earned it differently. She had earned it through the particular credential of having been publicly broken and publicly rebuilt, through having been honest when silence would have been safer and easier and far more comfortable. The congregation received her not as an heir, but as a minister in her own right. That distinction mattered enormously to her. It still does. The podcast came. The books came. Lost and Found. Woman Evolve. Real conversations about real things. Faith and sexuality and mental health and marriage and the complicated inheritance of growing up inside someone else's enormous calling. She built something. Not a replica of her father's ministry, but something that carried the same DNA, the insistence that God meets people exactly where they are, not where they're supposed to be. And then, in the way that life never allows anyone to arrive cleanly at their destination and simply stay there, the world shifted. 2020 arrived with its particular devastation. The pandemic, the cultural reckoning, the collective grief that no one had a roadmap for. Sarah Jakes Roberts, by now a recognizable face, a followed voice, a leader of something real, was navigating all of it publicly while also navigating it privately, inside a marriage, inside a blended family, inside her own interior landscape that had never fully stopped requiring tending. She turned 37. And something about that number, that specific, unround, unremarkable number, seemed to crystallize something for her that she began to speak about with an urgency that surprised even her most devoted audience. 37 is not a milestone age. It doesn't appear on greeting cards. Nobody throws 37 parties the way they throw 40 parties. And yet she began to talk about what it meant to arrive at this particular moment of her life with the full weight of her history behind her and the full length of her future still unwritten ahead. She spoke about her children, Malachi, and the children she and Teray had brought together into their blended family, and the particular terror of raising them in the public eye while trying to give them enough private space to make their own mistakes, to form their own identities, to be people rather than symbols. She spoke about her marriage with an honesty that other celebrity couples carefully avoid, about the work of it, the daily choice of it, the way love is not a destination you arrive at, but a practice you commit to with your whole imperfect self every single morning. She spoke about her body, and this, more than almost anything, landed with extraordinary force among the women who followed her. Because here was a woman who had spent years in a complicated relationship with her own physical self, who had gained and lost and gained again, who had used food as comfort and punishment and distraction, and she was now standing in that complicated history and refusing to simplify it, refusing to make it a neat before and after narrative, refusing to perform health for an audience. She was simply honest about the ongoing work of treating herself with the same grace she extended to everyone else in every room she walked into. She still carried the journal everywhere. That small, private act of survival from a 14-year-old girl in a house that felt too large and too watched, it had never stopped. The journals had multiplied over the decades, filled shelf space, become their own archive of a self in motion. And she spoke about this too, about the act of writing not as performance, but as necessity, as the thing that had kept her tethered to herself during every season when everything external was pulling her apart. At 37, Sarah Jakes Roberts stood in a particular intersection of time that very few people ever talk about honestly. Past the first chaos of young adulthood, not yet at the reflective distance of midlife, fully in the middle of the most complicated, most demanding, most meaningful chapter of the story. She was not finished. She was not figured out. She was not at peace in the simple, resolved way that tidy narratives require. She was alive and growing, and honest about both the beauty and the difficulty of that, which is rarer than fame, rarer than talent, rarer than almost anything else a person can offer the world. Her ministry, Woman Evolve, had by this point reached women in countries she had never visited, speaking languages she didn't speak, in circumstances she could only imagine. The name itself was the thesis, not Woman Arrived, not Woman Perfected, but Woman Evolve. The present tense, the ongoing action, the refusal to pretend that any of us ever finishes the work of becoming who we are supposed to be. She stood in arenas, sometimes the very same arenas her father had stood in, and said things that no one standing in those arenas had said before. She talked about trauma with clinical precision and pastoral warmth simultaneously. She talked about faith not as the absence of doubt, but as the decision to keep moving in the direction of something you can feel but cannot always see. She talked about the marriages that failed as part of the education, not as the disgrace. She talked about her son Malachi growing into a young man and the particular, heart-expanding terror of watching someone you love more than your own life navigate a world you cannot protect him from entirely. And she did all of this without ever pretending to be finished, without ever standing at a podium and suggesting that she had arrived at the place where the questions stopped and the answers began. That honesty, raw, sustained, specific, was what made her different. Not the name, not the lineage, not the platform, the honesty. Now, let me speak to you directly. Because this story, as much as it belongs to Sarah Jakes Roberts, has something inside it that belongs to you too. Something that is sitting in the room with you right now as you watch this, whether you recognize it yet or not. You have a version of that journal. Maybe it's an actual journal. Maybe it's a note on your phone you've never shown anyone. Maybe it's just a thought you think in the shower, the same thought you think every morning, the one that starts with a question you're afraid to answer honestly. You have a version of that hunger, that unnamed reaching for something you can feel the shape of but cannot yet see clearly. And you have, whether you acknowledge it or not, a version of that moment in the middle of the night when you sat with the full weight of what you had become and felt the distance between that and what you had imagined for yourself. This is not failure. This is being human. And the distance between where you are and where you imagined you would be is not evidence that something went wrong. It is evidence that you are still in the middle of the story. Sarah Jakes Roberts was 14 and ashamed and convinced that the most significant things about her were the worst things. She was 20-something and divorced and invisible in her own life. She was standing in her father's enormous shadow, unable to find enough light to see her own face clearly. And none of that, not one single chapter of that, was the ending. Neither is yours. The journal she started at 14, that small, unremarkable, private act of telling the truth to herself, became the foundation of everything. Not because the journal was magical, but because the discipline of honesty, practiced in private, becomes the architecture of a life that can eventually withstand being seen in public. What is your journal? What is the thing you do, privately, that keeps you connected to the truest version of yourself? The version that exists underneath all the expectation and performance and carefully managed presentation. Whatever it is, do not abandon it. Do not let the noise of everything happening around you drown out the quiet of what you know about yourself when you are completely alone. Because here is the question I want to leave you with, not as a challenge, not as an assignment, but as something to sit with in the hours after you close this video. If someone made a documentary about your life at the age you are right now, not the highlight reel, not the version you post, not the story you tell at dinner parties, the real one, the one with all the chapters you'd rather skip, would you recognize the person in it? And more importantly, would you be willing to? Sarah Jakes Roberts looked at every chapter of her story, the shame and the silence and the failed attempts and the quiet nights and the long way back. And she made the decision not to hide any of it. She made the decision that her mess was not separate from her message, that her wounds were not obstacles to her purpose, that the very things she had been most afraid of becoming were, in fact, the exact credentials she needed to say what she was put on earth to say. You still have that chance to. The journal is still open. The page is still blank. What are you going to write?